Alright, in this section we're going to talk about the Unreal Engine basics and how we're going to go about editing a level and some of the various tools we're going to be using. First thing we're going to talk about is the world space. The world space, you can see as we pan around, looks to be empty. The important thing we're going to talk about here in particular is how to think about it. And that is that it is initially a very large solid block, whereas a lot of level editors will have you build walls, for example, to encase an area. What Unreal will have you do is build primitive shapes, such as this one we've created right here, and carve them out from what is essentially a very large clay block. So in just a second here, what you're going to see is that we're going to subtract this using the subtract button, and it's going to create a room within the level. Again, imagining that we are taking this space out of the center of a very large clay block. You see here, if we right-click on the primitive buttons, we also get a dialog to determine what size and shape that they are. For example, this cube we've made 512 by 512 in width and height now. And then you can see over here in one of our orthographic views, we're going to move it up above this first cube that we carved out and subtract that as well. And now you can see we've got a little bit larger room with a pit in it actually in the center from that first area that we carved out. This is pretty much the gist of all of the work that you're going to be doing in defining basic areas within Unreal Ed, being that you're going to create some primitive shapes, carve them out from the world, and then afterwards what we'll do is we'll go back in and fill them with either static mesh content or particles, or all the things that build up a level that we're going to talk about later on here. So we've talked about how to think about the space. Now we're going to talk about how to think about the brush or the object we use to carve from the space. This is called the builder brush, and you'll notice we've been moving around this red outlined sort of wireframe cube here, and it's been a couple other shapes as well. This is what we use to carve out an area from the world, and it's called a brush, which tends to throw people off at times, but basically it's just something we're going to use to define a shape that we're then going to remove or alternately also add to the world later on. So you can see here we've sort of been cycling through the different brush types. You can see stairs, cylinders, spheres, and whatnot. We can also, as was shown earlier, alter the size of the brushes, and each of these is going to have their own unique set of properties. In this case, we're working with the cube and making a very tall, not quite as wide, sort of long shaft-shaped brush here. And what we're going to do is turn on the real-time preview so that as we move it around within the world, you can see that it's updating in each of the preview windows as we work with it. What we're going to do is pull it over to the side here and make kind of a hallway off to the side of this room that we built. And again, because we've defined this long, narrow path shape here, or this brush shape here, and subtract it, we're going to get a long, narrow area carved out from the world for us to use within the game world. So in addition to subtracting from the game world, what we can do is also use the builder brush to add geometry back to it. So in this case, what we're going to do is make the builder brush a bit smaller, just small enough, in fact, to serve as sort of a walkway over this pit that we've created in the floor. And then what we're going to do is in our orthographic and our perspective views, we're going to manipulate it to sit in place to be a walkway over the pit. And instead of pressing the subtract button, we're going to press the add button this time. And you can see we've added geometry to the level. Also, you'll notice when we come in on this that the wireframe for this is a different color. Blue is always going to be an add brush, and yellow is always going to be a subtract brush. You'll notice also that we've got a couple other buttons down there below add and subtract. These are intersect and de-intersect. I'm going to talk about those a little bit more later on as we get further into BSP authoring. But you can see how we've talked about how the world is a clay block and how to use the builder brush to add and subtract BSP geometry from the world. Very important how we're going to continue to work with the program. Now what we're going to talk about is how to do vertex editing. And so you can see here we've selected the builder brush. We're going to turn on a large vertices, and what we can do here is click on vertices to select them. And what I did there was control-clicked on a second vertice to select it as well, and then move it within the world using the standard controls. In this case, after I clicked on them, I hit the control button and then used the right and left mouse button to drag them up. You can see that I've added it there, and we've got a basically ramp-shaped object. Next we're going to talk about is the brush clipping tool. So what we're going to do here is give ourselves a cube-shaped builder brush within the world, and then we're going to create a plane to clip a portion of the brush away with. So you can see we've got our cube there. And now what I'm going to do is over on the left-hand toolbar, I'm going to click on the brush clipping tool, which you can see there. And once we've done that, we're going to go to one of our orthographic views, in this case the top one, and control right-click to place points to define this plane. You can see I've control right-clicked the first point and the second point, and we've defined this plane that intersects the cube there. Now, once we've created these, what we can do, we don't necessarily have to use them where they're at. Just like any other object we place in the world, we can go back and select them and move them around using the standard tools. So by selecting these guys and control dragging, we can move them around within the world to alter the orientation and placement of that plane that we're going to clip with. So you can see me doing that there in the first point, and I'm going to select the second point, move it around, and then what I'm going to do is click the clip button after selecting the builder brush. And you can see that what's happened is the portion of the brush that was on the side of the plane with the normal or the line sticking out of it was taken away. Also, you can see that I have flipped the normal of the clipping plane, and now the normal facing the opposite direction. When I press the clip button, it's going to remove the opposite side of the builder brush. So this is how we're going to achieve some fairly complex shapes when we're doing our building later on. Press the delete button here, and what we're going to do now is show how to not clip away, but to split a piece of geometry. This isn't helpful with a builder brush per se, but what we're going to do here is give ourselves a carved out room and an additive brush, and then clip that brush. So we're going to create a large square room, and then we're going to create a smaller cube within the room, and move it down to the floor here. And then we're going to add that geometry to the world. And so we're going to move the builder brush away here and select that new geometry. Place a clipping plane. And we're going to make sure the geometry is selected, and then we're going to press the split button. And now, instead of clipping it away, what we're going to do, or what we're going to create here, is two separate additive brushes within the world that are clipped along that plane that we defined. So you can see we've got one small corner of the upper portion of that cube that's been pulled away. And we're going to move those around in the top view there, come back in and rebuild our BSP geometry. And you can see now that once we rebuild the geometry with the brushes that have been added there, that we've got two separate chunks of basically that first additive brush that we created. So now what we're going to do is take a look at building a pretty simple level to the point where it's functionally playable. So there's a few key things we need to make sure that we do to make that happen. So the first thing that we're going to do here, and bear with me for a moment while I build through this, but what we're going to do is just build the basic BSP geometry to define the level space. So you can see that I'm building a cube, making it a bit wider here, and we're going to subtract that as a room within the world. I'm going to go ahead and make a different size cube here and use it to form sort of a hallway coming away from this room. You can see what I've done here also is adjusted the size of the grid snap area, and I'm going to use that to fine-tune the placement of this cube here. You can see as I adjust the size of the grid that's being displayed, altering, pull this guy over to the right here, make another hallway. And basically, we're going to flesh out the areas that exist within this world. You can see we're sort of creating hallways extending from all different sides of this room that we've created here. All right, so we got our extending hallways. Now what we're going to do is start to connect these a bit. What I'm going to do is go select the vertex editing tool and slant the end of this brush here. Hold down Control and Alt, and you can see that I've been able to drag a selection region around the vertices that I want to drag, and we're going to slant this guy so that we can sort of miter the ends of this hallway together. You can see once we've created that we can reuse it wherever we want to within the map here. I'm just going to drag around and add some stuff. Doing this sort of building can be a bit tedious, but it just sort of comes with the territory. And now that we've created those hallway sections, what we're going to do is create some adjoining hallway sections coming up from the other arms there. And so again, we're going to move the builder brush into place and use the vertex editing tool to modify the shape of the builder brush to be the shape that we want. So we're going to drag a selection on that guy, pull him down, pull this guy up, again, to form sort of a mitered corner here. And we're going to subtract this brush from the world. You can see I'm control right-clicking on the brush to rotate it. Just going to rotate about the pivot point that Unreal Ed creates for it automatically. And we're going to place the other guy and subtract him as well. And now once we build the geometry that we have in place, we've got sort of an infinity or figure 8 shaped area we're talking about. So that's great. But what we want to do now is add some light to it, because right now it's getting sort of a flat overall, pretty boring looking light applied to it. Basically no light. So what we're going to do is add this light and then rebuild the light in the level, and you can see we're getting a lot more dramatic lighting happening. So what we're going to do is place lights around the level, sort of point lights, to create a more interesting, dramatic looking lighting schema. And what I'm doing is selecting these lights and pressing Ctrl W to duplicate, which could also be done with the Edit Duplicate command. And then as I duplicate these, I'm just going to drag them about the level. You can see I'm doing it in my top view there. And as I drag these, Unreal Ed is going to try and approximate what the light's going to look like initially, but you can see we're not getting much in the way of shadowing, we're just getting a pretty default light. Once we rebuild it though, you can see that we're getting shadows from the BSP geometry that's been created in the level. And there we've got what is a pretty basically lit level, but is more interesting looking than what we initially started out with. Finally, what we're going to add is a player start, which when we right-click is in that default menu that pops up. This is an essential piece of functionality because it tells Unreal where the player is going to start out in the level. And you see we've placed it, we're going to modify the placement of it, and then rotate it a bit to indicate the initial player starting direction, and then we're going to save this file. And let's go ahead and play it and see it in Engine. Alright, so here's our level that we've created. We can move the player around within it, do everything that you can do in Unreal Tournament 2004, shoot, whatnot, run around, jump. And of course we haven't added any functionality yet, but we have the very basic skeleton version of what a level needs to work within Unreal. Which is of course all well and good, but what we're going to add in now is a little bit more of the functionality that we expect from a game like Unreal Tournament 2004. So we're going to open up the Actor class browser and go find ourselves some of the functional pieces we're going to use to create functionality in the level. For example, new weapon base here. Scroll down, select it, and then if we right-click on a piece of geometry within the level, go add new weapon base, you can see we've added a new weapon base. And we can go and modify the placement as we want to, again, using the standard move tools. And what I'm going to do now is bring up the property editors for this guy and change the type of weapons applied to them. We're going to talk about specifics of how to work with the property editors and whatnot later on, but in particular, just pay attention to the fact that we're adding objects to the level and then modifying the properties to create the functionality that we want. So we've created two weapon pickups here, and we're going to go in and add a health charger. Again, by selecting it in the Actor browser, right-clicking and adding it. You can see that it's adding a mesh to the level. It's important to note that we're not necessarily adding a mesh, we're adding a functional object that has a mesh attached to it. And again, this is all stuff that we'll talk about and elaborate on later on when we get to that specific portion of the DVD. So we're going to place the health charger here, rotate it a bit, because I like the placement of it better, rotate it on the 45 degrees there, and add a couple more things. We're going to add a few health files in here as well, again, by going to the Actor browser, finding them in there, right-clicking on the level, and adding them. And once we've added them, we can also duplicate them, again with the Ctrl-W key. I'm going to Control-Alt-Drag over the top of those and then duplicate both of them at the same time and use the Shift-Drag to drag with the camera over to the left there. And now we've created a small network of functional items in this level. Now, if we want to use this to work with any sort of bot or other characters within the level, it's best to place more than one player start. So that's what we're going to do here. Go select the initial player start, duplicate it, and drag it to the opposite end. Because what we're going to show next is running around in the level with a bot inside of it so that we can sort of see how it acts within the level with the functionality that we've placed. You'll notice I'm going to click the Build All button, and it's going to look as though It did the same thing as the build lights button did earlier. The important thing being, though, is that once we place this functionality, that the build all does a bunch of computations for how the AI is going to work with the level. And again, we'll discuss that in a bit more depth later on. But now we've rebuilt it, we've saved it, and what we're going to go do is play this and see how a bot works with it. Going to change the settings so there's just one bot in here with me. Don't want to get too trashed. And we'll start the match and run around here, and we can see that there's the bot. He's found us, found a weapon, sit there and try and shoot us, doing the basic things that the AI is going to, within Unreal Tournament, is going to have the bot do, to basically try and hunt us down and shoot us. But again, using the functionality that we placed in the level. So we've got the shock rifles that we placed there, the health files in the level, the health charger in the middle. And nailed him. Well, that's all well and good, but what we're going to discuss next is how to set up the level so that the bot AI knows how to navigate it a bit better. And this is done by pathfinding with path nodes. So within the level already, we've placed several pickup items. For example, the health charger, the weapon pickup, and whatnot. Those are something that Unreal Ed automatically creates paths with, or creates a network of interconnected objects, basically, that the AI knows to look for and navigate between. We're going to look at that connection here in just a little bit. But what we can do to create those manually is to create a path node. And you can see there I right-clicked and went to Add Path Node. And say, for example, I was to move that guy right there. I'm going to duplicate him, make another one. And if I wanted to have a bot be able to navigate this whole level, what I would do is create a series of path nodes around the level that were visible to each other and could form, basically, as the name would suggest, a path around the level. And so you can see here I'm placing it at basically all the major junctures that we've created. Important thing to note, and we'll touch on this again later, is that any given path node can't be more than 1,200 units. That's the hard-coded limit from any other object that is path notable within the level. Otherwise, it won't connect to it. So you can see here we've right-clicked on the perspective view menu and gone to View Path Nodes. And what we can see here is the path nodes that were created by those initial objects that we created last time we built. We haven't built since then, so our new objects haven't been included in that path node. But once we click on the Build Path button here, you can see that it's going to build a series of paths all around the level. Now, some of these are redundant. For example, the path nodes next to the player start and the path node that I placed on top of the health charger in the middle, as those automatically are counted as path nodes. But as long as we understand that we're creating a series of paths around this level, that's the important thing for the time being. And what we'll notice when we go in and play this is that the bot, whereas initially in the previous section, or in the previous level that we looked at, he was sort of sitting across the map waiting for us to get there. This one, what will happen is the bot will actually come hunting us down because the bot has a series of path nodes around the map to be able to find us with. There's, of course, a lot that goes into the AI here that we're not discussing. This is somewhat of an oversimplification, but you can see that the bot is actually running around gathering objects, and will come and hunt us down here in just a minute. There's all sorts going on under the hood here. Every time you move, the player technically is broadcasting sound across the map. The bot technically hears the sound. It goes to hunt you down, tries to figure out the closest possible or the quickest possible path through the level to get to you. You can see that generally it's being a lot more effective. It killed us this time. So we've seen how to take and build a level basically up from scratch, place some objects in it, and then modify the level so that bots were able to navigate it. Now what we're going to talk about is some of the browsers we're going to use to place content within a level and work within Unreal Ed in general. So you can see here we've got the buttons that are shortcuts to the browsers, and the view menu also has shortcuts to the browsers. First one we're going to look at here is the Actor Class browser, which we've looked at a bit previously. This is, again, going to allow us to place pieces of functionality within the level, which is kind of a broad term there, but basically it allows us to select an object, right-click, place it, which you can see we placed a new weapon base there earlier, health charger there, and then what's going to happen is each of these is going to have bit of a different effect within the level depending on how your engineers or the Epic engineers, for example, coded these. Next we're going to talk about is the group browser. So what I'm going to do here is select a series of objects that we've already placed within the level, open up the group browser, and create a new group. I'm going to call this main room gameplay. And once we've created this group, it is now a functional object within the level that allows us to either select all the objects within it or turn on and off the visibility. So you can see I can deselect the objects that are part of the group, select them by unchecking next to the name, you can turn off the visibility. In general, this is a very handy way of organizing what can be fairly complex levels later on. All right. Next is going to be the music browser, which actually we're not going to play too much here with. They don't have a lot of music content that we can open up in the editor. And in fact, if you try and open some of the music files there, it will actually crash because they just don't have supported music files that you can open. Sound files or the sound browser would be next, and you can go and select from any of the sound packages and click on a sound and play it. Don't have the sound coming through the capture here, but you can play it and hear it on your end. Of course, you can open other sound packages to get the entirety of whatever sounds they might have authored into them. Texture packages would be next, or the texture browser. This, of course, lets us select what textures we want to apply to either static skeletal meshes or to BSP geometry. And again, as with all the rest of them, we can select what package we want to work with and what texture we want to work with in that package. Meshes is sort of a legacy holdover from very, very early Unreal Tech, so it's not something you'll be working with really at all. Prefabs are interesting. What we're going to do here is go into the level and build something that we might want to place a lot of instances of, and not just one object, but a group of objects, for example, that we might want to be able to place and replace in one level or across several levels. And for consistency's sake, it's always nice to have something that you can place that is basically the same functional group of objects. So what we're going to do here is create just this little health object cluster, so two vials, charger, and a light above it. And we're going to go to the prefab and click on Create New, and we're going to enter a package name for it. We're going to talk a bit more about packages later on, so right now we're just going to call this Test Prefab Package and give it a name called Test Prefab. Click OK, and you can see what it's created is a Test Prefab Package and Test Prefab, and if we scroll around there we can see that it's actually the group of objects that we had selected. So if we go ahead and click Add to this to the level, which is a button up there on the top row, it's going to add the prefab that we just created, or that was in the prefab package that we could open, to the level at the position of the camera. And then we can take and adjust and place and orient that as we want to. Next will be the static mesh browser. This is, of course, how we're going to place quite a bit of the geometry, the detailed geometry within the level. You can see there the health charger mesh. You can see the material properties for the static meshes down there on the bottom. Again, as for everything else, we can go and scroll around within packages, select different objects. We can open different static mesh packages. Static meshes are, again, a key component of how we're going to be working with these levels, and the analogy that's used quite a bit is we use them as Lego blocks or building pieces, because we'll create a very basic level and then stack these all around the level to build the detail for it. You can see I'm just sort of scrolling through here randomly. We've got some light meshes here, sort of a wall light. And once we've selected a mesh that we might want to place, what we can do is very similar to placing actors, go out into the level and right-click in the level somewhere and add static mesh. And as with everything else, we can move it around, rotate it, place it as desired, scale it if necessary. And of course, in a full level, there ends up being quite a bit more static meshes there. Finally, we've got the animation browser, which is the most complicated browser there is, and we're not going to go into the full detail of how to work with that in this DVD. That'll be later on. But you can see we can look at skeletally animated meshes and their animation. What we're going to do here is open a character model, in this case the ZanRobot character. And we'll zoom in on him. And the wireframe for a second. Quite a bit in the way of functionality here that we're not going to touch. You can see we're playing through one of the animations, several of them for that matter. And really, there's just lots of animation sequences that the game, of course, strings together to form the full movement for the player, or possibly scripted sequences or whatnot. Again, there's just an exceptional amount of functionality here, and we're not going to touch on all of it. This DVD, by any stretch of the imagination, you can see all sorts of different menus and options and buttons going on here. We're going to touch on those in the content creation DVD later on. So again, we've covered the browsers we're going to be using for creating and adding content to the level. And now let's go talk about the properties editor. So all of these objects that we've placed within the level now all have a series of properties that define how they work. Some of these properties they share between all of them, and some of them are specific to the type of object that it is. So let's go ahead and select this object down here, this light, and pull up the properties editor, which we can do with either the F4 key or by hitting the actor properties button in that top row of tool buttons. You can see it pulls up a great big long list of properties that are organized into distinct groups that we can expand or contract, and that we can also go ahead and modify the size of the column there between the name of the property and the value of the property on the left-hand side. This can be handy for when we have properties that have really long names, or for example, if we want to get more space on the right-hand side for property values that have really long names. So you can notice here, for example, I'm in the display properties, adjusting display-oriented properties, the draw scale, whether or not it casts shadows, whether or not it has static lighting on it, unlit, lit, close, whatnot, all sorts of things that are topical to display properties. So you can see we've changed it to false and rebuilt the lighting, and there's no shadow cast now. Change shadow cast back to true, and it casts a shadow. We'll go over here and look, for example, at this weapon base that we placed earlier, and we can go down to its own unique set of properties, the X weapon-based properties, and change the type of weapon that spawned in the level. So for example, change it from a shock rifle to a redeemer. Go over here and select one of the health files, for example, and change the amount of healing that happens when the player runs over it. Sit here and enter that to 50, for example, if we wanted to give the player a big treat. So again, this is the way that we're going to add either custom functionality or set the functionality for the objects that were the actor objects that we're placing on the level. Here you can see we're taking the light and adjusting the color of the light. We can either do that by going to the color picker or entering numeric values. And this sort of illustrates another good point. The properties editor, a good thing to keep in mind, is there will be different ways to modify different types of values within the editor. You can see here we've got a sliding rail that has a numeric value next to it. Saw before we used the color picker. You can enter numeric values again directly. Boolean values we can double click on to alternate between true and false, or we can click on the pull down menu. Some of them will require us to enter specific types of entries, either actor names or tags or whatnot, and we'll discuss those as we get there. Go ahead and look around the level just to some of the other objects. Again, just illustrating the point that each of these actor objects is going to have their own unique set of properties that sort of dictate how they act functionally within the level. All right, so that's going to cover actor properties. Now let's go ahead and take a look at surface properties. What you'll do is we'll select on this, click on the surface here to select it, and then pull up the surface properties, either by clicking the surface properties button or right-clicking on the surface and going to surface properties. And that's going to bring up this dialog. The first tab of this dialog, flags, is going to have flags for the functionality of the surface, and we'll touch on those more when we get to the BSP section. Pan, rotate, zoom tab, or excuse me, scale tab will have buttons and entries for adjusting the values of the pan, the rotate, the scale of the texture on the surface, and whatnot, the light map values. All of this we're going to get more in depth on again later on in the BSP section. We can adjust the alignment of the surfaces to each other. As you can see here, what we're going to go do is look at the seam between two of these BSP surfaces, and that there's not quite a lineup between the textures. So what we're going to do is select all these textures and align them together. So all sorts of functionality in this surfaces properties editor as well. I'm going to touch on those again later on. Most important thing to understand now is how to bring that up and how to get at the surface properties for a BSP surface. All right, so now let's elaborate a little bit more on actors. We've used the term actor a bit now, and let's go ahead and talk about functionally what an actor is and how it works. You'll notice that at the top of this list, there is an object in the actor class browser, I should say. There's an object called actor. Actor is the base object for anything that we place within an Unreal level. It has a base set of functionality that's been coded for it by engineers that allow it to do things like interact with the network, determine how it's displayed within the level, determine all sorts of very basic attributes. And when I say basic, that's sort of a misnomer because there's lots of very advanced things that happen here, but it's a base set of values that are able to be a base set of values and functionality. Then after that, we have this full list underneath Actor that is all sorts of different objects that have been custom coded on top of Actor. Now what's happening here is each of these has the same base functionality that Actor has, but they've each had their own custom functionality coded on top of it. For example, Navigation Point here has had functionality coded on top of it to allow it to be used as navigation points by the bot AI within it. And then underneath Navigation Point, we've got all sorts of other objects, which is used by the bot AI for things like determining where to jump, where jump heads are, where path nodes are, and whatnot. So again, it's taken the base functionality of Actor and then added new function on top of it. XPickup base down here, for example, has taken the base functionality of Actor and then added the functionality for pickups on top of it so that when a player runs over the top of it, it can pick up whatever the object is. And then underneath that, more custom functionality has been added on top of these objects that allow it to define something, for example, as being a weapon within a level or a health charger within a level. So again, the important thing to understand here, can't stress this enough, is that it is a base actor object or a base object which has base functionality and then layers of functionality are added on top of it with custom actor objects underneath them. This is called inheritance, where we'll take and instead of reinventing the wheel, we'll create a new object and then create only the small portion of functionality we need for that new object, which then reuses all of the base functionality of its parent object. Next, let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about packages as well. Packages we've used quite a bit so far, and what a package is just sort of a logical grouping of objects within Unreal or Unreal Ed. So what we're going to do here is go down to the game directory and look at the install directory at, for example, all of these folders. We've got animation folders, which have animation packages. We've got static mesh folder, maps folders, textures folders. All of these have packages that exist underneath them. Now, packages can be a bit of an ambiguous term to understand, so we're going to go into this in a little bit more depth. Basically, what a package is a logical grouping of asset types or content types. So, for example, we have .u packages here, and what these contain is snippets of code or actor classes or actor objects. And then we have textures. These contain only textures within them. When we go to the texture browser, we look at texture packages. Texture packages are going to contain texture objects. We can open one of the new texture packages, for example, or one of the existing texture packages in there and take a look at its contents. So again, just understanding that packages are logical groupings of objects, and what Unreal has done is taken and organized them into several different types of packages: static mesh packages, texture packages, sound packages, music, animation, prefabs, and meshes, which is a bit of a legacy one that we don't work with too much anymore. All right, now we're going to take a look at a couple other pieces of functionality in the editor. So far we've covered some pretty broad basic functionality. I'm sure, as you can see already, there's quite a bit to it. There's also quite a bit in the way of other editors here that you can work with to create other types of objects or levels. For example, we're going to take a look at a terrain level here. This is Unreal Ed's height map editor. And you can see here that we've got this pretty nice looking outdoor terrain in one of the Onslaught maps. And this is the terrain editor, and basically allows you to determine the height map of the surface and how textures apply to it, and static meshes that are used as deco meshes and all that on it. It's a pretty detailed piece of functionality. We're going to cover that in the second DVD in the series. You can see here quite a bit to it. It brings up its own dialog box, has all its own editing tools within it, brushes for working with the surface and whatnot. So again, quite a bit there. We will touch on that later. This right here is the Matinee editor. It's used for creating scripted sequences for either in-game cinematics or other sorts of automated things that happen within the game. You can see here this is one of the training DVD cinematic, or excuse me, training level cinematics. And it's, again, got its own dialog box with quite a bit to it in the way of functionality and features. We're going to cover that one, another DVD as well. Go over here to this side of the map and look at another piece of functionality that may seem small at first, but is pretty deceptive, and that would be emitters. Let's go over here and get on top of one of these fire emitters in the wreckage over here on this map. To see emitters, we got to turn on real-time preview. And you can see here, we've got this fire emitter emitting particles into the environment. If we pull up the properties editor for this guy and sort of expand the list there, these are the emitter properties. You can see there is quite a bit here, and it gets fairly complex into how we work with these and edit these. So we're going to look at those later on as well. And finally, we'll take a look at the script editor here. We're actually not going to cover too much in the way of script editing because that belongs more in a programming class, but this is where the custom functionality for each of the objects is defined. And of course, when you open up Unreal Ed for the first time, all of this is going to be defined for you. This is what defines how the game works and has been written by Epic thus far. But in a custom mod, if you wanted to, you could get into scripting your own custom functionality. Going to look at the animation editor here. This will be covered in the content creation DVD. There is just so much here to how you define how to work with the animated objects, having things happen on certain frames, spawning sounds, spawning special effects, how to link animations, how to layer animations. It's just a whole lot going on there that is going to be covered, again, in the custom content creation DVD. All right, again, this has all been a lot of functionality that exists within the editor. We're going to cover these in other DVDs. Just wanted to point out to you there is quite a bit more to what's going on here, and we will get back to it all. So for the remainder of this DVD, we're going to concentrate on doing BSP authoring, static mesh placement, functionality placement within the level with actors, and we're going to create a fully functional deathmatch level.